All right, so today we get to begin our unit on imperialism. Imperialism is very simply a time period during the late 1800s in which the powerful industrialized countries of the world go out and take over the non industrialized, weak areas around the planet. We're going to talk about their motivations today. So, today is going to be about motivations and causes. And then as the weeks go on, we're going to get into the what it looked like in specific areas such as Africa, India, China, and then around the Americas. All right, so new imperialism is going to be from about 1880 to about 1914. Now, that 1914 date is really significant because 1914 is when World War One begins. So this is going to lead us right up into World War One, and this is actually going to be one of the causes of World War One. So the things we're talking about right now are not just an isolated incident, but this is a part of the larger movement that leads up to a really significant conflict. But very simply, this is a time in which the powerful European countries take over less powerful countries in these areas. So the people in Europe are going to go in and take over areas in Africa, the Middle East, India, China, Japan, East Asia, and then parts of the Americas as well. New imperialism is very simply the extension of a nation's power over other lands. Now, the reason we call this new imperialism is because sometimes people call the era of colonizing America old imperialism. That's when Columbus comes over and discovers that there's a new world there, and then Portugal, Spain, France, and Britain rush over to try and colonize the different areas. That's called old imperialism. New imperialism is once these countries have industrialized, they are going out and looking for resources for their factories. One of the things they want is direct control if they can get it. All right, so these nations essentially come in and take over, and then they have direct control over those local governments and those local people. If you hear people say colonialism, it means the same thing as imperialism. They're pretty much synonyms. So I just wanted to throw that in there in case you come across that in a discussion or a reading. Now, new imperialism, I gave you a date earlier, about 1880 to 1914. Some people argue it starts even earlier. So here I gave you an earlier date. But it's very simply what I've said several times already. The strong industrialized nations of Europe using imperialism to seize colonies and dominate local governments and economies in Africa and Asia. The most dominant of all of these nations is going to be Great Britain. Great Britain is going to take over so much of the world, it's ridiculous. But these powerful countries are going into these areas for a couple of motivations that we're about to talk about. What they're doing is they're taking over, they're using those areas for their resources, and they're using those areas as markets to sell their goods. So some good comes from this for both sides, the powerful nations and the countries being taken over, but some negatives are going to happen as well. All right, so the first cause we're going to discuss is economic causes. Economic causes. Money tends to rule the world, guys. So if you can find an incentive for someone to do something because it will make them rich, chances are someone's going to try it. So in this particular era, what happens is that factories in these industrialized nations, they need resources. They need rubber, petroleum, manganese, different types of metals, different cotton, things like that. And so when they need these resources, they need to go out into other areas to get it. Now, once those things, those resources are turned into goods, right? Let's say you go and you get all these materials to make clothing. You take that into your factory, you put it together, you make a shirt. Well, now you need to sell that shirt to someone. So the other thing that these people wanted were new markets for their factory goods. So it's not just that they want resources, but they want people to sell to. And then lastly, the colonies gave European population a place to go, vacations, or just to move to get out of the crowded cities if you don't like the urbanization taking place. So the economic motivations can be seen in this drawing here. All right, so in the top left corner of the map, you see Great Britain, that little blue island. What they're going to do is they're going to sail along that red line all the way into India, and they're going to take the raw materials from India, put it on a boat, send it all the way back to Britain. Once it gets to Britain, they're going to use their factories to turn those raw goods into, or those raw materials into goods. Now, India can't do this because they don't have factories. So then Britain takes their goods that they've just created, put it back on a ship, sail it back to India, and sell it back to those local people. Now, the good thing here for the local people is that they now have access to cheap goods that have been made in factories that they would not have otherwise had access to because they were not industrialized nations. The downside is they're being controlled by a foreign power. They're coming in and sometimes being exploited for their resources. So it's not all good, but it's also not all bad. The second major cause we're going to look at is political and military. Um, at this time, these nations are going to have naval ships. And in order for a ship to survive in a navy, you got to have bases around the world. If your ships have to come back to your country to land and go into port to refuel and get food and water and that sort of thing, then your ships can't go very far because they always have to turn around and come back home. But if you can get naval bases all over the world, your Navy ships can now travel all over different seas and oceans and still have a safe place to land or resupply. So it was imperative that these nations, for military reasons, took over these areas so they could build military bases, especially for their navies. Now, the other thing that comes here that's political is the idea of nationalism. Nationalism is that strong sense of identity and that strong pride in your country. Well, at this time, nationalism is gaining popularity. Many people are feeling very strong nationalist tendencies. And so countries want to essentially prove that their country is better. And part of doing that is to build an empire to increase their nation's prestige or their reputation and their power. So let's not pretend that the only reason this is happening is for money. There's also the idea of national power and national pride in going and building an empire. In the modern world, we look at this idea of going out and taking over a weak new land as wrong, as maybe morally a moral problem. It's not right. At this time, most people didn't think twice about it. That was just the way of the world. The powerful end up winning. The weak end up being told what to do. I'm not saying it's right. That's just kind of human history wrapped up in a nutshell. That's just what happens. Now, a third cause, we're going to just lump in and call social causes. There's going to be some prevailing ideology at the time that in the modern world we would label wildly racist. So I'm going to talk about it here, and don't misunderstand me and think that I am advocating for these ideas. I'm just sharing the way that people thought at the time. So there were many missionaries living in Europe that wanted to go out and spread their religion, and their religion happened to be primarily Christian. So during this time of imperialism, many nations thought it was a good thing that they could send people to these foreign lands and teach them new religions. Not only were they teaching them religion, but they also were teaching them new cultural ideas. Europeans felt themselves culturally superior, the way they lived, the way they thought. And so they thought it was their duty to go out and teach these less civilized people how to act more civilized. Education, medicine, food, clothing, the way they behave, their manners, that sort of thing. Now, part of this idea comes from something known as social Darwinism. Darwinism was a scientific theory that was very popular during this time. Charles Darwin came up with the theory of evolution, which is sometimes called Darwinism. It is the idea that mankind and all living creatures evolved from a single celled organism that over time changed and got bigger, better, and more complex. You see in the background picture here where you have a monkey on one side and a human being all the way to the right. Darwinism teaches that humans evolved from monkeys. Now, that Darwinism, that idea is applied to countries and cultures. The idea becomes, well, if creatures and living things evolve and get stronger and better, maybe nations and cultures evolve and get stronger and better. Maybe some countries are better and therefore should rule over the weaker. Because the other idea in Darwinism is something called survival of the fittest. The strong survive, the weak die off. The strong survive, the weak die off. And we see that in nature all the time. So some of these people are going to argue that that should be extended to cultures and nations. The strong countries should survive, the weak countries should die off. Now, that's not their way of saying that these strong countries should go in and just kill everybody. but they should go into these areas and show these people a better way to live. The idea that European culture was superior to many of these other areas because they were industrialized. They had access to technology and education that many people did not have. Now, some people end up labeling this idea white man's burden because obviously the people living in Europe were white, and the areas they were going into, the people were not white. They were black in Africa. In India, they were Indian. China, Asian. So many Westerners are going to think that they're somewhat superior because of their culture and more advanced, and they had a responsibility, they had a duty, or they had a burden to share that. So it's not the idea that, oh man, we're Europeans, we are just so much better than everybody else. They should serve us. It was more of an idea of, we have figured out a better way to live. Let's go teach this to other people. Now, in the modern world, there is still some of that, but we would label a lot of these things somewhat racist, right? The idea that some cultures are just better than others, and they should go out and change them to be like them. But these were a lot of the motivations of the people during this time. So now what you're looking at is what would now be considered a wildly racist cartoon. But you have Uncle Sam that's going to represent the United States, who is also engaging in imperialism, trying to educate these lesser groups, or these groups that are not as civilized, quote unquote. So in the back of the classroom, you see the children of America sitting quietly learning because they're civilized. And up front, you see the territories that America has conquered: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines. And they are drawn to look, quite frankly, just less evolved, right? Now, this cartoonist is actually making fun of these ideas and showing how it's wrong. And we're going to look at this later and look at it because there are a million elements to this that make it so interesting. But this is a good way of showing how some people were thinking. They were thinking it was the duty of these more powerful, more civilized countries to go into these areas and teach these people a better way to live. Now, lastly, we have technological causes. New technologies just made it possible to go into these areas and conquer it. Europeans now have powerful armies and navies. So when they show up on your shores and they're like, we're in charge now, the local people can say, no, you're not, all they want, but they're going to lose a fight. And so most of the time they didn't have to fight because it was very clear and obvious that we would never be able to fight against this more advanced civilization. But riverboats, steamboats, warships, railroads, they make it more available to get into these areas. If you go to Central Africa or India and you've got a whole bunch of resources you need to send back to your country, having steamships and riverboats and railroads makes that a lot more effective. New medicine is huge. Africa had been insulated for a very long time and protected by disease. Anyone who was not from Africa went to Africa. They got bit by mosquitoes, and many of them died. So Africa was not conquered by anyone outside of their continent for a very long time. However, new medicine makes it possible for people to go into Central America and go into Africa and be protected from many of those diseases. Also, these countries have machine guns, repeating rifles. I mean, just technology that if you did not have those things, fighting against it was next to impossible. We'll look at several examples of rebellions against this imperialism. Almost all of them fail. All right, so that's where we're going to stop. When we come back with our next lecture, we're going to talk about what it looks like specifically, imperialism specifically looks like in Africa. So there you have our causes for imperialism. You've got the technological causes, making it possible. You've got the social causes, making people believe that they had a duty to go out and help these people. You had the political and military causes where they wanted bases around the world for their navies and the strong sense of nationalism. And you have the economic motivations of making money by getting resources and having new markets. So that's your introduction to the imperialism, and those are your major causes of new imperialism.